In this video, we'll be reviewing Measure What Matters by John Doerr. A excellent introduction to the subject of a management trend that is being adopted within a number of organizations called objectives and key results. Welcome to Strategy Books, introducing leaders to the books and ideas that make a difference, and most importantly, the books that can help you make a difference in the world around you. Hit the subscribe button to stay current and that bell to be notified every time there is a new video up. I'm Mark Mullally. Follow me here, and you can also connect on Twitter and Instagram at strategy_books. As always, the links to everything we discussed today can be found in the description below. So, let's get started. Where do I begin with this book? Measure What Matters is actually a relatively recent book. It's about 4 years old. It was published in 2018, and it was written, by John Doerr. Now, he is a relatively well-known and famous individual in the context of technology and in the context of Silicon Valley in particular. And so, into not just entrepreneurship writ small, but entrepreneurship trying to shoot for billion-dollar unicorns. And he's had some success in that regard, being one of the very, very earlier investors in Google, for example. But he started out his career at Intel, and while he was at Intel is where he got exposed to the concepts that are contained within this book. So this is not his idea specifically. He has become an advocate, he has become an evangelist, he has become a champion of the idea of objectives and key results, or OKRs as they are referred to. And he has, in doing that, introduced them to a number of very well-known, famous, large, successful organizations, several of whom tie, at least in part, their success to the ability to be able to adopt and implement this framework, the idea of objectives and key results. And so why did I pick it up? Right now, I can't turn around in a crowded room without hitting an OKR. I don't spend a lot of time in crowded rooms right now. We are still in the middle of a pandemic, but if I was, it is astonishing the number of people in business that are talking about this as a concept and are trying to implement it within their organizations. And that, for me, is really what prompted it. Was I see the implementations, and it wasn't about, oh, how do I jump onto that bandwagon? It's I see those implementations, and I see a number of flaws and challenges in many organizations that are actually trying to adopt and use OKRs. And so I wanted to understand, what's the fuss about? What's actually being recommended and advocated, and where perhaps are organizations going wrong? Because this book is the reason that OKRs are talked about so much. It's in reference to this particular volume and consulting in it that organizations are taking on and talking about it. And that's not unusual. I mean, we've seen it with other books as well. We've seen it with things like the Balanced Scorecard. We've seen it with Blue Ocean Strategy. We have seen it with Jim Collins' Good to Great. Organizations, successful organizations, large organizations, particularly organizations with names like Google, there is an inherent presumption, and it is coded into the essential principle of best practices, and we all know how I feel about that. But there is the essential presumption that, well, if it's good for Google and it works for Google, we should do that too. And that statement may be true if you are a large multi-billion-dollar provider of search engine functionality and a whole bunch of other stuff. But Google is its own organization. It is its own culture. It has its own complexities and particularities around how it functions, much of which are rooted in the personalities, the biases, the ambitions, and the leadership framework of the founders. And so there's a lot that comes with Google that's more than just what's contained within one book. And that's where we've got to be able to separate out and say, how much of that is OKRs and how much of that is Google, and how much of it is the unique intersection of one with the other. So, my approach to this was really around the idea that many implementations of OKRs that I've seen aren't great. They're not really well thought through. Um, and part of that is that when it is implemented, it's added to everything else that's going on within the organization. It's not connected and it's not aligned. Often it's not supported, or it's subverted, or it's sometimes not complied with. But for me, it was an interesting book as well to explore, because I work in strategy. I'm a strategy consultant. Strategy is what I do. And this is all about goals, and then about delivering on results and how you actually deliver on those goals. And so my goal was as I say, to understand what the fuss is about. Where are organizations either going wrong based on the recommendations, or where are the recommendations not landing well? And what really does this have to offer, and how does it actually fit? And so that's why I, as I say, picked it up. Let's step back though, and let's talk about, so in writing this book, what was Doerr trying to do? And I've already acknowledged that Doerr was not the inventor of OKRs. He was an early user of, because he started his professional career anyway, as a summer intern in between years at Harvard Business School, in Intel in Silicon Valley. He was hired at a very young age and stayed with the organization. He was actually guaranteed a position once he'd graduated, and so came back to the organization. Very quickly got exposed to Andy Grove, who's CEO at the time. Andy Grove's leadership and management style, which was built all around the idea of OKRs, around, again, objectives and key results. Now, Grove didn't invent that from a blank piece of paper either. It basically built on the management philosophy of Peter Drucker in the idea of management by objectives, which was a giant fad in the 1960s and 70s, and actually still being talked about and used into the 1980s. But it, as with so many things, fell out of fashion, and it got revived in the context of Intel, in terms of saying not just it's about coordinating and cascading and being clear about the objectives we're trying to deliver, but being able to translate those objectives into, so what is it you tangibly have to do? How do you actually deliver on this successfully and well? How do you actually accomplish the thing that you're trying to realize? And so Grove built and structured this, and actually achieved huge success in terms of not just rolling out, but actually using and tying the implementation of objectives and key results with the attainment of some fairly significant strategic objectives at Intel. And he tells, John Doerr tells the story of that around particularly a campaign that was called Operation Crush. It was a 1-year drive in response to the threat of Motorola as a microprocessor provider and the manufacturer of their 68,000 chip, which was at one point also contained within the Macintosh. It was basically about their year-long fundamental, headlong, bet the company goal of beating Motorola, and in doing that, beating them soundly, establishing dominance for, at that point, it was the 8086 chip. It was the precursor of the 8088 that was put into the IBM PC. It is the basis of all of the Intel chips that are used in not just Windows computers, but up till recently Macintosh computers as well, the 286, 386, 486, 586, and on, into the Pentium processors that we have today. All of them share that heritage from that one campaign that was built around and on OKRs. And as I say, it was a bet the company strategy of everybody needs to pull together in order to be able to accomplish this. And as the story is told by John Doerr, they were incredibly successful at actually doing that. And so what Doerr's trying to do with this book is really to more broadly continue the advocacy and the evangelizing campaign that he's been doing company by company, working with different organizations. He talks about the afternoon that he brought OKRs to Google as a potential idea, and he actually frames out what his objective and key result for that was: to deliver a presentation that was done on time, to be able to help them work through defining what OKRs for them could look like, and to get them to actually adopt it as a framework. And so his success in that afternoon was tied to, does Google actually adopt this or not? Which long story short, they did, and have continued to refine and have continued to employ. And when we think about what that means in reality, Google is a giant company. They have thousands of employees now, and every employee, every business unit, every department, every group has a cascading set of objectives, all tied to what Google is trying to accomplish. And it's not just driven top down. There is room and there's desire for agency, for autonomy, for the expression of how best can individuals and individual organizations and departments and business units best contribute to what Google is trying to do. And so there's an interplay and there's a back and forth between the OKRs that are set organizationally and theoretically then drive objectives through the organization, and those that are set individually. And so what he's trying to do is be able to provide the advocacy and the explanation and the case studies that go with it to be able to illustrate how organizations have been successful, to be able to advocate for how organizations can be successful, and to be able to provide the framework and the guidance to be able to say, and what would that look like and how would you actually do it? When we think about where it delivers value, it's actually a really good book. It's well written, which is lovely. That's not always guaranteed within the business press, but it's always fabulous to be able to see. And it does a really nice balance between storytelling, advocacy, illustration through case studies, and providing some level of practical guidance about what does this do and how does it work and how might an organization or an executive or a team actually adopt and use this as a structure. So there's a lot within that is quite useful and quite helpful around that. When we think about the value that's delivered, he starts off with the history of where they came from and gives full knowledge and credit to, Andy Grove was the original pioneer and champion of OKRs as a framework. Intel was the primary, it was the alpha case, if you will. It was ground zero of the developing and testing of OKRs, and it was the laboratory and it was the case study that led the framework to being what it is now. And he talks about how it was applied and the both successes and challenges, because it wasn't perfect and it wasn't perfectly adopted and it wasn't universally embraced, but how it was sold and how it was advocated, and goes on then to share the experience in other organizations, like, for example, Google, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who have again adopted OKRs as their overall framework for not just goal setting, but actually measuring and evaluating accomplishments, and organizations like MyFitnessPal, which, basic exercise and diet tracking program, been around again for a few years, was acquired by Under Armour, has been an incredibly successful case study and story. What's important to be able to recognize in this book is that he's really clear about what OKRs, what objectives and key results are and are not. And what I appreciate about that is he's also very clear that there is no one right way to do this. And I guess one of the arguments that I had with the book as I was reading it, I'm going to say a small a argument. It wasn't about hostile. It was about, I would see illustrations and I would see examples and I would highlight, well, that doesn't connect here, or that's inconsistent with what you said about this case study over here. Well, now you're talking about how it was successfully applied in an organization where they had a different mandate or a different focus or a different approach. And he's very honest about those inconsistencies, that there is no one right way to be able to do this, and organizations need to find the way that works for them. And so what works ultimately falls into a category of it depends, which for anybody that knows me is pretty much the phrase that I use most commonly when I'm talking about just about anything, particularly in a client and consulting context. Not because everything is possible, because there is more than one way to effectively do most things. And so what organizations need to do is to find the way that works there in the context of who they are, what they do, what their industry is, their culture, their leadership style, their maturity, their capabilities in terms of where they are, and based on where they are, where they can get to from here. And so Doerr, in talking about and describing OKRs within the book, is very much approaching it in that same vein. That there are different implementations and different emphases and different assumptions and principles that have been adopted into the introduction and rollout of OKRs within the organization. I think where I have a challenge, and it's not with the book, it's about what's done with the book, is while there may not be any right way to use them, there are many wrong ways. And organizations do that quite regularly. And that's where we start to get into the difficulties, because there are also many ways to actually be able to do this wrong. And unfortunately, people seem to have an appetite to do that. And the fundamental driver I see behind that is wanting to short circuit and get to the finish line, wanting to be able to take the surface appearance and structure of objectives and key results. They find the idea and its simplicity appealing, and simply roll that into and apply it over whatever else exists within the structure. And this is a really interesting thing. When you read the book, the organizations that have been really successful about adopting objectives and key results as a framework and methodology are successful because it is their way of, in essence, setting and following through on annual plans that are driven right down through the organization. It is not an adjunct to other planning processes. It is not bolted onto the strategic planning or business planning or budget setting or performance management process. It's the process. So you take a Google, or you take a Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where at the outset, or at least very early in their organizational lives, they adopted and implemented the OKR framework. It was their foundational approach to thinking about strategically setting longer-term directions. It didn't displace anything that was there before it. It was put in place from the outset as the framework that says this is how we're going to identify what we want to accomplish, declare what we're going to do in accomplishing that, and measure and evaluate how we function. But for most organizations, that's not where they're starting. They're starting with they've got strategic planning process, at least one. Some, ironically, have many. They've got a process of business planning. They have a framework for performance management. They have a budget planning process. They may also have an annual planning process. And all of that exists within the organization, where introducing OKRs as an overlay to that is an absolute disaster waiting to happen. And yet that's what I see many executives actually doing. What's wonderful about the book is it does go into relatively extensive detail about what objectives and about what key results are. And it provides different definitions of objective. So one of the really interesting things, and this is again where their implementation challenges, is the idea of stretch objective. And unquestionably, Doerr is an advocate of stretch goals. And he actually references Jim Collins and the idea of the big, hairy, audacious goal, the BHAGs. Again, an acronym that I come very close to despising, but we're going to not talk about this because I'm going to come back and talk about Jim Collins' Good to Great at a future review. However, Doerr likes big goals. Doerr likes audacious goals. Doerr likes, not necessarily about the company, but stretch a lot. Create ambitious targets to be able to work towards, because that's how you're going to win. It's not about incremental progress. It's about looking for exponential accomplishment beyond what is normally expected or recognized or accepted or believed to actually be possible. And so that fundamentally fits within that. Now, one of the challenges with that is you're not always going to be successful on stretch goals. And again, he acknowledges that, but what doesn't get addressed within that is the psychology of what that actually means. Because when you're talking about setting goals and measuring results, you're talking about the distinction between success or failure. And that is a really interesting continuum discussion that weaves throughout this book about what actually constitutes failure. Because one of the things, there's a really interesting case in terms of how he describes how Google has adopted this, is basically if you get your key results, on average about 70% accomplished, that's a win. So it's not about 100% delivering on what you said you were going to do. It's about setting a significant objective, defining key results that actually support that objective, what you're going to do, and then measuring and evaluating your performance against that, where pretty good is considered to be a success. Now, depending upon the organizational context, that's going to be a difficult discussion to happen. A lot of what I have seen in terms of implementations of OKRs is you set a key result, it had better be delivered on. And that's tied to performance management. That might be tied to bonus. That is tied to evaluation. And so you're setting a key result, failing to deliver, runs significant risk of being found wanting, and potentially, in the worst case scenario, that being a career limiting move, which has some consequences, because what we're going to do then is we're going to play it safe. The key results that I declare then are the ones that I know I can actually deliver. I know I can accomplish. I know I can make happen. And that's where we run into the entire house of cards tumbling down, because what we're doing then is playing it safe, making incremental changes that we know we can manage, which probably looks a lot like what we already are capable of doing because we're doing it today. One of the other definitions that he talks about in this is the idea of committed objectives versus aspirational objectives. And again, this runs into the track record around success. The idea of committed objectives are and should be pretty much fundamentally deliverable and deliverable at 100%. But aspirational objectives are a different special case. They're a different subset that represents, again, that awesome stretch for the fences that may not be as successful. And so for some organizations, they have adopted that distinction of being able to delineate between them. And we get to the expectation of and the definition of key results as well, about what will be delivered. And again, Doerr is very consistent and focused around that should be clear. It should be specific. It should be, I have met it, yes or no, whether that is a binary yes or no, or it is measured as a percentage. So if my key result, for example, is to bring in 10 clients, it should be absolutely clear, did I deliver on that or not? And all of this gets structured into one overall framework that says objective plus key result equals a framework that lives together. And so the objective is, what are you actually trying to accomplish? What is the outcome that should be realized? And the key results are, what are you going to do to accomplish and deliver that outcome? And where they are tied together is the key results that are identified, if attained, mean without fail, the objective has been arrived at. You have attained what it was that you set out to do. And this is probably where I actually have the biggest problem, because honestly, when we're talking about goals at the level of organizational strategy, when we are talking about goals that are related to uncertainty and big, complex, difficult problems, when we're talking about goals tied to innovation, there is a lot of fuzziness and looseness around that. And Doerr allows for the fact that you might have to revise and might have to reframe and might have to think differently about your key results. But there are some connections there that I would have liked to see being more tightly made in terms of really setting up and dealing with less tangible objectives, and also sometimes the fact that key results can be ambivalent and they can be difficult to define. And if the objective in all instances is something that I can clearly say got done or didn't, we can find ourselves living in a gray space that says, the things that I need to do to be successful here are not necessarily always clear, are not necessarily always certain, are going to require a level of exploration. And that idea of gray, in how it's defined and how it's described, doesn't necessarily exist in a significant way. And so building in and allowing for gray is important and fundamental, and you've got to be able to think through what does that again mean in the specific of this context. And even the example that he uses, and it's one that is referenced by many of the organizations that have adopted OKRs. He constantly uses an example of a football team, and so his objective for that football team is, what does success look like? Well, success is win the Super Bowl. Now, let's be clear. There are any number of professional football teams in the United States. Only one of them wins the Super Bowl every year. All of them want to win the Super Bowl every year. But for this particular team, the key objective, the overarching objective for that organization is win the Super Bowl. And the example he uses then has 3 key results. So those results are passing attack needs to amass 300 plus yards per game. Defense needs to allow fewer than 17 points per game. And special team units rank in the top 3 in punt return coverage. Now, I am not a massive football fan, but we're basically covering off the essential structure and essential roles of our football team there. And we're setting some meaningful results to be able to attain. So here's the thing. If you actually do those 3 things, will you win the Super Bowl? The answer? Maybe. On a good day? Perhaps. On a bad day? Perhaps not. Accomplish the results may still not actually deliver the win. And so when we talk about key results being inextricably tied to objectives, there's a bit of a gap that again needs to be allowed for of you can do and deliver on the key results. And you can do that with intensity, and you can do that with an attitude towards compliance. And in either of those instances, you may still not fully deliver on the objective. And there are going to be other factors and other things that need to be considered above and beyond what's defined there. But there are going to be things that are within your control, and there are also going to be things that are not in your control. So there's no guarantee. You may get to that overall result, you may not. And this is where we start to be able to deal with some overall challenges around how overall integration gets managed. Because within the book, the expectation is the key results do deliver. If you do the work, you're going to attain the goal. And that is the fundamental critical challenge that we're having to wrestle with. So what does this overall mean? I think the book has a lot of value. The book has a lot of interest. I enjoyed reading it. As I said, it was a well-written book as well. Do I think you should read it? If you haven't, and you're interested in strategy, and you would like a framework to think about goal setting, I'd absolutely encourage it. Because it provides, and this is often a essential focus in terms of how we think about changing how we function. It provides a really simple structure that has a lot of depth to it, that all of my cautions notwithstanding can be applied with thought and with care in just about any organization, and can help in the absence of clear goal setting with providing a means to be able to do that. Now, it needs to be considered in the context of everything else that goes on within the organization. You can't just apply it on top of what's already there and hope for the best. That is not going to work. And so what you've got to think about is what will work. What will work here? How do I actually apply and adapt? And broadly, you want to be able to get support in terms of accomplishing it. If you're going to read the book, I would encourage you to read the book in its entirety, though. There is a lot of nuance. There is a lot of gray. You are going to have many instances where you go, hang on, what you just said there doesn't fully jibe with what you said 10 pages ago, or 5 pages ago, or 3 chapters ago. And those ambiguities are there because those ambiguities exist in how different organizations have actually adopted and implemented the Okr framework. And so you want to be able to both accept those nuances, you want to take under advisement and consideration the implications of those various different nuances. And you want to be able to take them as illustrative of the possibilities of where you can actually take this. Doing this as a quick read to be able to say, okay, got the principles, I can go and apply that, is a dangerous, dangerous, dangerous way to go. There are a lot of resources in here. There is a very practical focus to it. He includes, for example, as Appendix 1, the entire Google Objectives and Key Results framework. and playbook, how they think about applying and using this. Again, I wouldn't necessarily adopt that wholesale, but it's as an illustration of what an organization has specifically do. It's an awesome resource to be able to provide, recognizing that it's an example, it's not the way. And so how deep should you go? Really as deep as is necessary to be able to understand what's there, recognizing there's going to be more work beyond in order to be able to do anything with it. You're going to have to move into the gray of great structure, great concept. How can I apply it in the context of where I work, whether that's within a team or a department or a division or a project, or whether you are responsible for the strategy of an overall organization. It's the thinking and it's the care and it's the design of the ideas that are going to be fundamental. For me, I was pleased to read the book in that the cautions are there and the different illustrations are there that set up. Here are the discussions that you need to have. Here are the things that you need to think about. Here are the challenges that you're going to find along the way. And he doesn't shy away from those. But what it does speak to is the fact that when people are reading this book and trying to apply the principles within it, either they're not reading fully, they're not reading in depth, or they're not taking the cautions about how to actually apply that. And that's where there's more work to do and there's more thinking to be done than is simply contained within the two covers. But overall, Measure What Matters by John Doerr, an excellent book that I did enjoy reading. I think it's a valuable addition to any manager, executive, or strategist bookshelf. I think it's something that can fit within the overall context of a strategic framework, recognizing that you still need to be able to think about how it actually sits and how it connects and how you apply it. But it's got some really, really good ideas to be able to work with. Thanks for joining us on Strategy Books. We'll be back with another episode soon. If you're interested in the books we talked about today, you can find links to them in the description below. Be sure to subscribe, and if you enjoyed today's recording, please hit that like button as well. It helps others to be able to find the recording. Let me know what you got out of the book in the comments below. Comment as well if you have questions or you have ideas for a future book. Thanks, and we'll see you again soon.